Okay, so as previously mentioned, so my name is Phil Renforth. I'm the science coordinator for the Greenhouse Gas Removal Research Programme. That's a programme that was funded by the UK Research Councils in 2017, and most of the projects are running and hoping to finish up by the end of this year. So it's been about 4 years of running so far. This webinar series is a chance for all of the PIs within the project to present on their projects. I'll just flick to my next slide. You can see that we've got quite a wonderful program of webinars over the next few weeks, stretching until April. Next week we'll be we'll hear from Professor Ewan Nisbet from Royal Holloway University talking about new methodologies for removal of methane from the atmosphere. To say, if you want to sign up and register for these, you can go through our you can go through our website, and if you look at latest news, you'll see a link to all of these webinars. We'll also be tweeting about it, either the program's dedicated Twitter handle or mine, so follow along and you'll receive updates. We'll also be hosting the videos on our YouTube channel. So we've only got one video on there so far from last week. So if you missed last week, you can catch up there. If you search GGR Research UK, you should be able to find it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speaker for today's webinar. It's Professor Pete Smith from the University of Aberdeen. Pete is a chair in plant sciences, as a plant and soil sciences, I believe, at the University of Aberdeen. He's co-leader of the environmental modelling group there, and his research interests include global change impacts on ecosystems and soils. Pete's the PI for the GGR research project on, it's got the wonderful acronym of Soils-R-GGREAT. I always forget what that actually stands for in terms of the acronym, but it's a wonderful acronym. So, Pete, if you're ready to share your slides, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Phil. So can you see those? Yeah, okay, great. So Soils-R-GGREAT, great acronym. As I was thinking of finishing work there when we'd created the acronym, I thought job done. But it stands for Soils Research to Deliver Greenhouse Gas Removals and Abatement Technologies, which makes Soils-R-GGREAT. So it's a partnership with University of Aberdeen, Scotland's Rural College, Cranfield University, University of Edinburgh, Newcastle University, CCAPS, which is part of the CGIR programme, and the James Hutton Institute. And the current members of the project are listed here. So what I'll be presenting today is sort of a run through of the project. It's not finished yet, so it doesn't yet form a coherent narrative, but I'll be pulling out some of the highlights and some of the areas where we've done great work and where we still have great work to do. So the main thing that we're looking at here is the soil-based greenhouse gas removal options. We're pretty good at estimating the biophysical potential of these various options, but there are also economic and societal limits that prevent their widespread implementation. So in the centre, we've got the supply of negative emission technologies, if you like, and pushing in from the outside are all of the other economic, biophysical resource, societal and climate limits. So the aim of this project was to do a bit more of the assessing the potential, but also to look in more detail at what the LCA impacts, the socioeconomic impacts and the social limits to implementing these greenhouse gas removal technologies, specifically in the soils. So when we came up with the project proposal, our aims were to quantify land and biomass availability, the resource availability, identify the most promising GGR options for each region that may differ between regions, to assess the social, cultural and ecological impacts of soil-based GGRs to see where they can deliver co-benefits and where there are potential trade-offs, and to assess the economic potential and the current restrictions. So we identify that, identify the resources available. Then we have 4 work packages in the middle, which basically do these assessments and assess the socio-cultural and ecological impacts and constraints, and we sort of iterate around this circle until we get closer to reality. Then sitting outside this, we have a full life cycle analysis of these various options, and then we assess the economic potential for each option. So that's basically a cost benefit analysis and the generation of marginal abatement cost curves. And then we aim to, we've not done too much of this yet, but to assess the current policy restrictions and the future policy options. And finally, we have a synthesis and cross comparison with other technologies through cooperation with other consortia. Again, I think there's more work to do there. So the first thing to do is really define the practices. So we put together an invited research review, which was published in Global Change Biology, where we looked at the measures that are possible. So these are the measures that we can use to intervene in the soil system, and the various practices that are associated with these measures, and the different pathways that we can get to delivering greenhouse gas removal from soils. And these mainly involve either reducing the losses from the soil, reducing the carbon losses, or increasing the carbon inputs. So we came up with a long list. Some of them are traditional ones that increase the soil organic matter, and we got some other ones like carbonation and enhanced weathering, which partly overlap with other projects, but and the addition of biochar, for example, but we're also investigating those. So the first thing we try to do is to model the impacts of the changes of those practices. And to do this, we're using the ECOS model. The ECOS is a dynamic model of soil carbon and nitrogen. It's a process-based biogeochemical models, and the drivers are the met data, the soil info, the above ground biomass, and the management. And it runs with gridded inputs, and you can run it at any scale, but we're trying to run this globally. And we can run it at a resolution of anything, a finest spatial scale of 1 kilometre. So we can zoom in and look at different regions of the world to see what's possible. We got an example here for looking at a cost validation. This is looking at a sugarcane to arable transition in Brazil. This is just showing some of the results where we got the measured and the modeled SOC values, and we're showing quite a good R squared. I've not put all of the metrics up there, but it's showing that we have a reasonable agreement between the modeled outputs and the measured outputs. And then what we're doing is we're applying it globally. So we're using a version called Global ECOS, which is contains the main soil and characteristics of the grid. It's a 0.5 degree, the output is at 0.5 degrees, and it outputs the SOC change until 2100. And the inputs are the harmonized world soil database, that 1 kilometre global gridded data, the CRU climate data, and management data. Now, we're quite good at doing croplands. So I'm just going to give you an example from the croplands. These are still simulations which are chugging through, but I'll just give you an example. And then I'll go on to some of the things that we're not so good at. The grasslands, where we don't have very good input on the carbon inputs and the management, because those data layers don't exist globally. And also on perennial crops, where we have a lot less information and a lot less parameterization of the model. And some other specific aspects that I'll come on to later are the addition of biochar, carbonation, and enhanced weathering. So some overlap there with other projects that are going on those specific topics. But let's just have a look at the croplands first. So this is an example. We run from 1901 to 2000 to get a stable SOC. So this is the spin up, if you like, with a stable climate, stable management, and conventional tillage. We then run a brief transitional period from 2100 to 2020, where we use actual climate data actual yield and fertilizer and sowing and harvest dates. And then we do a forward projection from 2021 to 2100, where we're just using, in the first instance, the A1B climate scenario. We're using average yields and fertilizers from the baseline, and then we're applying different managements to the different crops to see what the change in soil carbon would be. So this is a way of assessing the biophysical potential in a spatially disaggregated, high resolution way, and that's not really being done globally, and we can get some estimates then that we compare to other global bottom-up estimates. So this is just what we're looking at here is wheat. So we're looking at wheat with conventional tillage and wheat with zero tillage, and these are global runs. I'll just show you this example, and then we're running that out to 2100, as I said before. So the 2020 to 2050, these are the preliminary results that we're getting out. It doesn't say that wheat is grown in every pixel that we're showing here, but it's saying if you did grow wheat on a hectare within this pixel, this is the sort of change in soil carbon that you would expect. So some areas the zero tillage is giving us fairly low returns in terms of soil carbon, and in some areas we're getting up to about 0.4 tons of carbon per hectare, so non-negligible increases in soil carbon. For most of the globe, it's in the region of about 0.1 to 0.2 tons. So that's not a huge amount of per hectare emissions. The sort of removal intensity is not that great, but because we have such large areas of the planet that are covered by cropping, then we can aggregate these small per hectare values up. They sum up to quite large values when we add them up over the globe. Another slide just showing what happens from 2050 to 2100. And what you can see there is the potential is coming down somewhat. That's because the change isn't linear. So as the carbon stocks begin to saturate, then the amount of additional removal goes down over time. So we'd expect soil carbon as a greenhouse gas removal option would be best applied beginning quickly, because it will saturate in the second half of the century. So we could use soil carbon sequestration for GGR to hit our net zero targets. And that's when it helps us, as with other biological sinks, helps us to hit net zero whilst we're doing our other efforts to decarbonize the economy. So that's what we can do well. And I could have put up lots of examples there for different crops and different management practices, but that's just one example. What we can't do so well and what we've got less of a handle on are the inputs that we need for grassland. So we've initiated some work on modelling grassland productivity. So this is work that's being done at the University of Edinburgh, and it uses model data fusion. LAI specifically, leaf area index, is the data that's being used in the model data fusion. The data assimilation system is called Dalek. So it's the one that Matt Williams and his team has developed. We've got results available for wheat, maize and soybean. But the bit that I'll be talking about today is the recent work on grasslands, so that we can get a better handle on the potential in grasslands to increase soil carbon sequestration. So this is a quick look at what Dalek does. So we've got the model drivers shown here in green, the data constraints shown in blue, and then we got the carbon fluxes, the GPP, MPP, heterotrophic and autotrophic respiration, and then the methane from animal digestion and the animal respiration. So this is the basic model that we're using for data assimilation. What you can see here is some examples of satellite data of leaf area index at different spatial resolutions. So what's shown here is going down to 30 meters up to 1 kilometer. And we're testing using these inputs on leaf area index at different spatial resolutions to see how well we can simulate the carbon inputs and all of those components of the carbon cycle that I mentioned. We tested this out at 3 grassland farmlets situated at Rothamsted in North Wyke down in Devon, which is we got an LAI time series taken there, the met data, and we got ground estimates of biomass and removal via grazing and cutting. So we use this information, and I'll show you some results without training, how we're using this information to simulate the various components of the carbon fluxes in grasslands. So this is an estimate of the simulated and the ground-based estimates in different years. So the productivity varies in different years, of course, as you'd expect. And these are the simulated and the ground-based estimates. So we're fairly pleased with this as a mechanism of getting inputs that we then feed to the carbon model. So this has been quite successful, and it's a couple of papers are being worked up or are submitted on this topic at the moment. We can also look at the carbon allocation associated with it in each year, and the amount that the carbon that's associated with roots, the above ground, and the autotrophic respiration. You can see that that varies between years depending on whether it was a dry year, a warm year, a wet year, etc. Okay, so we got the grassland global, we got the cropland global runs, which I've shown you. We got a way to get a better estimate of the grassland inputs, which we'll use for the grassland runs, which will take place during this year. But I'll give you a couple of examples of some life cycle assessment that we've done on carbonation and enhanced weathering, because there are other, these are other technologies which are used on the soils. They're not soil carbon sequestration, organic carbon sequestration, but they are GGR options associated with the soil. So this was published in the Journal of Cleaner Production, assessing the potential of soil carbonation and enhanced weathering through life cycle assessment. And this case study was in Sao Paulo state in Brazil, and this was led by colleagues at the University of Cranfield. So the idea of this was to assess what the potential of both carbonation and enhanced weathering were, and then basically to see how far you could move that material before you stop getting a net benefit. So the transportation is the main process that affects the LCA. So because the rock is heavy, the ground rock is heavy, or the carbonation material is heavy, you have to transport it over large distances, and that can form a big component. The energy that you use in that transportation can be a big component of the overall life cycle, the life cycle emissions. So what it shows here is that for a typical truck in Sao Paulo, enhanced weathering, for enhanced weathering, you could move material over about 1,000 kilometers, and for carbonation, you could move material for about 540 kilometers before you started getting into a net carbon balance. So this shows the importance of the locality of the material that you're using to the place where it's spread on the fields. That can have a big impact on whether it makes sense or not to do carbonation or enhanced weathering for greenhouse gas removal. So some of the results are here, but for Sao Paulo state, the application of crushed basalt at 1 ton per hectare to all of the state's 12 billion hectares would capture about 1.3 to 2.7 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So accounting for the emissions, that can reduce the previous CO2 capture claims by around about 50%. So that shows the importance of this this life cycle analysis approach, because when we include transport emissions, that could reduce the overall impact on the climate. Another example we looked at, which is not soil organic carbon sequestration, is the use of biochar. So I'm going to go on to a life cycle assessment in a moment, but I'll just talk about biochar's effect in the soil first. So biochar is pre-stabilized soil carbon, which is formed by pyrolysis of organic materials, feedstocks. So they're burned in an oxygen-starved environment, and it produces a material similar to charcoal, but it's called biochar. It's pyrolyzed material, which is relatively stable when you put it into the soil and can give other co-benefits as well. Here are some examples. So these are the different feedstocks here, going from rice husk, miscanthus, softwood, rapeseed straw, and then if it's pyrolyzed at 550 or 700 degrees, you get these different characteristics. So there are different feedstocks, different pyrolysis temperatures lead you to very different forms of biochar. So this is just to show that biochar is not a single thing, it's a range of products. So this was published in scientific reports, and it was modeling the potential of soil carbon sequestration using biochar from sugarcane residues in Brazil. The sugarcane residues are currently not used in a constructive way, but if we examined the potential of converting those to biochar and then reapplying them to the soils. What we first had to do is create a model of biochar use. So we created a model based on Roth-C. This is a traditional Roth-C, but then we have a biochar submodel included, which looks at fresh biochar, recalcitrant biochar, which has a slower turnover time. And we applied this model then to look at what impacts we would have by applying it again to Sao Paulo state in Brazil as our case study, because we have good data there. And we show for various time slices and various types of biochar, we get different sequestration potentials. But the key findings are that the available sugarcane residue allows the production of 4.2 tons of biochar per hectare per year. That could increase soil carbon stocks by about 2.35 tons of carbon per year in the sugarcane fields across the state. And scaling that to the total sugarcane area would amount to 50 megatons of CO2 equivalents per year, which is 31% of the CO2 equivalent emissions from the state in 2016. So there's really quite a large potential, an unrealized potential of using biochar in Sao Paulo state, using these residues which are not otherwise used constructively. We could create biochar from those, and we could create a very large sequestration opportunity in some provinces, and so in particular in Sao Paulo state. The next step was to convert this into a life cycle analysis. So this is just looking at the soil carbon gains that we get from applying biochar. The next step was to look at a life cycle analysis to see how the emissions and greenhouse gas removals all add up. So this is in review at the moment in the Journal of Clean Production, and it's an anticipatory life cycle assessment of the biochar use from sugarcane residues to include all of the other aspects of the life cycle. In the LCA, we find that the marginal electricity production is used, and these sub-scenarios are based on the biomass allocation to the biochar production. So we've used a range of different scenarios and a range of different assumptions about how the energy has been generated to come up with the total likely LCA impact. What we find is that the main impact, the main positive impact on the greenhouse gas balance is obviously the biochar addition to the soil. That gives us about 2.35 tons of carbon per hectare increase in the soil on a year-by-year basis. But the biggest cost is the electricity deficit from producing that biochar. So we have to take account of both the increases and the decreases, and the electricity deficit is going to be the main thing that we have to consider. That brings down the average sequestration to around about 1.7 tons of carbon per hectare, but still a useful GGR technology. Accounting for the emissions does lower that carbon capture potential by about 25%. Allocating 100% of the available sugarcane residues to biochar could sequester about 6.4 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year, and scaled up for the entire state, that practice could lead to the removal of about 23% of the total state's greenhouse gas emissions. So it reduces the amount that it contributes to the emissions because we've taken into account other aspects of the life cycle. So the number that I showed previously, 30%, comes down to around about 23% when we include the additional carbon emissions from energy inputs. So the other thing that I mentioned, so we've done carbonation, we've done biochar, we've done enhanced weathering, we've done the croplands, we've done the grasslands. What we do less well is the perennial crops. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples from perennial crops, in this case vineyards, and what's happening with soil carbon change in vineyards. So this is work led by SRUC. And they've looked at a meta-analysis of conventional management versus carbon sequestration practices in French vineyards. There are 50 studies selected, which gives us 146 comparisons. And the practices are pruning residues, cover crops, organic amendments, no tillage and biochar amendments. The average sequestration rate is an impressive 7.5 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year. And this is a paper that's in revision in the Journal of Cleaner Production. This is showing the organic amendments, biochar, pruning residues, no-till and cover crops, and some combinations of these different practices, giving us quite high carbon sequestration rates. As I said, the overall average is about 7, but some of them giving sequestration rates up to about 10 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year. We got some other work in vineyards, mainly because we like wine, but it's also interesting scientifically, I suppose, is we've got another paper, which is with the editor, submitted to the Journal of Cleaner Production, where we predicted and mapped the abatement rates in wine growing regions in 6 European countries. So that's based on this meta-analysis, extending it out to other countries. This is in review at the moment. And we've also done a survey of wine growers, which is going towards looking at the social barriers and the cultural barriers to implementation of these practices. What are the motivations and barriers to adoption among wine growers? Would they consider doing these practices, or are there reasons that they don't wish to do them? So this analysis, we've had responses from 400 wine growers in France, and we're analysing the factors that influence soil carbon sequestration practices, and that paper is nearing submission at the moment. So we're hoping to have that one submitted soon. So that's giving us, albeit in a case study, looking at specific case study of vineyards, that's giving us a better handle on what options are available in perennial systems like crops, like vineyards. That would include things like oats, olives, figs, citrus fruits, and other sort of perennial crops such as those. The next thing to look at in one of the work packages is the cost benefit analysis and the development of marginal abatement cost curves. So we're quite good at estimating the biophysical potential for carbon sequestration, but we're not so advanced in looking at the what makes economic sense. So moving from the technical potential to the economic potential of the mitigation. The cost analysis is being done at SRUC, Scotland's Rural College, and this is the sort of information that's needed. So we have what we're aiming to get to is the abatement rate, the abatement potential, and the marginal abatement cost curve. But we have a whole bunch of things going into this: the cost of implementation and the benefits of implementation, the greenhouse gas abatement, the results from it, which is dependent upon a whole bunch of management factors. We do Monte Carlo simulations, And from the baselines and the uptake, we estimate existing uptake and the maximum potential uptake. And all of those together lead us to estimating these economic potentials at the bottom. The data requirements are shown here. I'm not going to go into this in detail, and you don't need to look at them in detail, but it just shows we need a huge amount of information for this sort of cost benefit analysis and this sort of LCA. So this was just an internal working document to say, where are we going to get this information? Where do we already have high quality information where we don't need any improvement? You'll see those are quite a small number of cells. And these are cells where we're working on getting better information, which will improve the economic assessment of the potential for soil carbon sequestration. We're doing these in these measures. We're looking to assess the marginal abatement cost curve for wheat in Western Europe, for maize in the USA, for managed grassland in Brazil, for rice in India, and for cassava in Africa. This is to give us a mix of crops that cover wide areas, grasslands which cover wide areas, and specific crops such as rice in India and cassava in Africa, so that we make sure we have a deep dive into these, the techniques that are available in developing countries. So we're identifying the mitigation measures, estimating the abatement potential, but we're also trying to look at the interaction between measures and the estimating the additional uptake of the measures. And that is work that is still ongoing, which I hope will have completed by the summer. So here's an example. I mentioned that we're doing wheat in the UK as one case study. So this is an example for wheat in the UK, generating the marginal abatement cost curve. We estimate the impacts here using the IPCC model. We've got information on optimizing the use of organic amendments, which is coming from the literature. And then we have woody biomass integration or implementation of agroforestry as shelter belts, fence line planting, hedge expansion, or rows of orchards. So we're considering all of these in a multifactorial way to see which ones contribute to greenhouse gas removal and to the economics of that greenhouse gas removal. And here's a preliminary sequestration marginal abatement cost curve for UK wheat, and the preliminary results show us that the marginal abatement cost for optimizing pH is negative, very largely negative. So this is an option that can be used which wouldn't cost anything, and at relatively low cost, restoring organic soils and polyculture, improving and renovating soil mineral drainage are low cost options, and the higher cost options up to 60 euros per ton of CO2, agroforestry, grass lays, and winter fallow cropping. But this is important to work out which measures are likely to be economic and which would be implemented more quickly by farmers in reality. So this is just an example. We'll have many, many other examples when we've completed this work. So I'll just summarize quickly with the output so far. So as you can see, at the end of many of those sections, I was saying we've not completed this yet. We've got papers in submission. We've got papers in preparation or in revision. But we've already got 65 journal publications to date. So it's quite a good output from the project, I think, including 2 papers in Nature, 1 in Science, 4 in Nature Sustainability, 4 in Nature Climate Change, 1 in Nature Communications, 1 in Global Change, 1 in Global Environmental Change, and 13 no less in Global Change Biology. So it's a really good output, I think, in terms of quantity and quality of publications. But we've still got work to do. We've got work to finish and papers to finalize and publish. We've yet to pull it all together. The reason this presentation doesn't have a clear narrative is because we've not synthesized all this information together yet. And that's yet to be done both through the modeling and through a synthesis activity. And that's something that we aim to do over the coming year. The one thing that we haven't done very well is engage with other GGR projects. So we've had a little interaction with Fab GGR, which you'll be hearing about later. But I know there are other projects that have been working on carbonation and enhanced weathering, and we've only had limited interactions with those so far. But there are some obvious overlaps, and the interaction begins with this presentation. So if you're interested in any of these aspects and you've got them going on in your project, please do get in touch and we can see where we can collaborate. And the last thing we do, the GGR demonstrator projects were announced last week. So for the remainder of this project, we'd like to engage with those new GGR demonstrator projects to see what help we could bring in delivering those in the remaining months. So that's a really whistle-stop tour. I banged on for about 35 minutes, so I'll stop there and I'll be very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Pete. That was fantastic. Really nice overview of. It seems like so far a really successful project. If anyone's got any questions, I've opened the chat up and you can unmute yourselves. But I'd appreciate if you could just raise your hand. So if to do that, you can go into the participants list, I think, and just click raise your hand function, and I can call on you to ask a question. Veronica, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you know what is currently being done by, for example, governments to promote these GGR approaches in like farmlands or different areas.
Yeah, the DEFRA at the moment favour options other than soil carbon sequestration. There's a worry in the UK government and in governments generally, I think, that soil carbon sequestration is difficult to measure and to verify. And they're also worried about the fact that soil carbon sequestration, like all biological sinks, is reversible and it saturates. I would counter that by saying, although it saturates and although it's reversible, we've got to hit a really, really challenging net zero target by 2050. And we really need all the tools in the box to address that. So I would say, despite those drawbacks, and they are real drawbacks with all biological sinks, we have to use it as best we can, especially in croplands. We know that our croplands are depleted in soil carbon by about 30 to 60%. On average, about 40 to 50% of soil carbon has been lost since they started to be cultivated. Whether we could get that all back, I don't know, but I do know that we could increase that soil carbon. So I think there's something we can do to improve the management of croplands in particular, and to integrate other systems into the farms, such as agroforestry, improving hedgerows, which could help us meet our net zero targets. I don't think we're in a position to say I don't think it's going to be possible to do it. We shouldn't try because there are too many downsides. I think we've got to try everything.
Thanks, Pete. We'll go to Spirios and then Rob, if that's okay.
Pete, thank you so much for the presentation. Very, very interesting. I just have a quick question about the LCA, because you apparently examined the greenhouse gas emissions, but what about the rest of the impact categories? For example, you may have a huge impact, I don't know, in ecotoxicity or in human toxicity. Is there a trade-off that you use in your LCA? Because you might remove carbon dioxide, but you might impact another category.
Yes,
I was just wondering.
Yeah, that's true. So I think there are some things that aren't included in the LCA. So it includes all of the greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon emissions. That's included in the LCA. Some of those externalities that you just alluded to haven't yet been included systematically. I think that it's important to include those co-benefits and trade-offs, because there are co-benefits too, of course, to include those co-benefits and trade-offs that can't always be captured in an LCA. So when we talk about an LCA, it's a sort of a carbon greenhouse gas LCA, but it's not necessarily a full environmental externality LCA. I don't think we do those very well for any products at the moment, but that's certainly something we should consider. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Rob?
Thanks very much. Hi, Pete. Thanks for an really interesting talk. I had a question about the effects of some of these soil amendments or soil additions on crop yield, but also on the sort of biological functioning of the soils, with things like changes in ratios between bacteria and fungi and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. Most of the organic emissions, most of the organic additions to the soil, so in composting and adding organic material as like manures, that's generally beneficial for to the soils, and generally beneficial to the productivity of the soils. Some techniques that, such as zero tillage, can be detrimental for some aspects of the soils. For example, it can cause a change in the fungal to bacterial ratio. It can increase the plant pathogens that are in the soil because you're not ploughing it up and exposing them to the air and such like. So there's a mixed bag. Generally speaking, though, increasing soil carbon increases the productivity, and there are some relationships between increased productivity in croplands and increased soil organic matter. So Ratan Lal did a nice review a few years ago in 2015, where he looked at the average increase in soil in cropland productivity associated with every 1 ton of hectare increase in soil organic carbon. And for maize, you get, for example, between about 200 and 400 kilograms extra per hectare per year by increasing the soil organic carbon by 1%. That's mostly in developing countries. Okay, thanks, Pete. Just also, what about the sort of more recalcitrant stuff that you might add, the enhanced weathering and that kind of thing? Yeah, that's right. So adding biochar, adding biochar is generally good. You get bigger yield increases in the tropics than you do in temperate regions, but generally it doesn't do any harm. And it does good where it does anything. For enhanced weathering, there's some increasing evidence coming out of David Beerling's group that you also get a benefit to yield by putting crushed rock dust on, because it's providing nutrients, and it's also has the same effect of liming the soil. So if you've got an acidic soil and you put the crushed rock dust on it, it improves the pH, raises the pH, and increases the productivity. So generally speaking, there are no big no-nos. Enhanced weathering, if you're using material that contains contaminants, heavy metals, that could have detrimental effects, but those can be, you can check that before you put it on the soil, basically. Lovely, thanks, Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'm just going to ask a quick question that came in the chat, and then we'll let Jeanette ask a question. So Will Burns asks if your agroforestry research is restricted to the UK.
It's not. We're looking at it in the specific case studies. So we'll be looking at agroforestry in all those case studies, both for the LCA and the economic analysis. So some of that, for example, in Brazil, where we're looking at grasslands, that would be silvopastoral systems in Brazil. So we don't have the results yet, but that is something that we intend to look at if we don't run out of time before.
Great, thanks. And so Jeanette, if you would like to go, just after Jeanette, I'll ask William Austin's question and Paul Burgess from the chat after Jeanette. Yeah.
Hi, Pete. You spoke about croplands in the UK being the soils where we've had the greatest losses, so there's the greatest potential. Do you think we're in a position to be able to target government support for soil carbon sequestration measures? Should we be only funding farmers with denuded soils? And also, you've talked about kind of biochar, enhanced weathering, soil carbon sequestration management. They're all things we could do to some soils. How far away are we from being able to say what's the right thing to do in a particular place for the UK? Yeah, so I think the government in England, at least under its ELM scheme, has the potential to do this, because it's going to direct money
public money for public goods. So I think it has the potential to direct that at farmers who are managing their soil health and increasing their soil carbon. I don't think it will. You could argue that farmers who have grasslands and are maintaining large carbon stocks, but they're not changing very much. So I think the grassland farmers would say, pay us for protecting the carbon stock. I think the government would be reticent about doing that because you're not actually removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. I think we are at a stage where we could soon say these are the sorts of soils, these are the sorts of production systems where it would be a benefit it would increase your soil carbon if you did these practices. We know which ones are good, we know which ones are effective, and we know broadly where they work. So I think we'd be soon in a position to give a sort of a broad brush rule of thumb. These are the sorts of areas we should be targeting with these measures.
Okay, thanks very much, Pete.
Thanks, Jet. Just a couple of questions from the chat first. So this one's from William Austin, says, what, if any, negative feedbacks might arise from saturating carbon in soils in terms of their wider ecological function, e.g. accumulation of biochar year on year?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. So generally speaking, biochar is fairly, of its nature, it's fairly inactive, it's fairly inert biologically. So it's the sort of thing that you can add to soil without having too much impact on the biological function. If you then started to lose that biochar as particulate organic matter into watercourses, then you could be looking at other impacts, but you'd have to get to really quite high levels before that became a problem. So I'd say, generally speaking, at reasonable levels of application, it will give benefits and won't give too many negative environmental impacts. But if that became crazy high levels of application, then we'd have to look at that again, because it's probably a non-linear response. Thanks, Bill.
Great. So I'll give you another one from the chat, then we'll let Dimitri get in, and then David, if that's okay. So Paul Burgess from the chat. Do you want to ask your question, Paul? You've just popped on your webcam.
Okay. Thanks, Pete, for your presentation. I think the answer's been answered in the question's been answered in the chat, but it was just to clarify for the agroforestry marginal abatement cost curves that they included the sort of vegetation carbon as well.
Yes, that's the main thing. Actually, you get a bit of soil carbon sequestration under the trees that form the part of the agroforestry, but most of the benefits will be in the vegetation carbon. That's being considered in the NFU has a net zero target by 2040, and they're looking at improving trees in the landscape and hedgerows and improving those aspects, and it's the vegetation carbon that they're targeting. So that is included. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So Dimitri, would you like to get in, and then David after him?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Pete. Thanks for the great talk. Just wanted to clarify whether you have looked into impacts of climate change on the sequestration outcomes. You mentioned A1B simulations for your agricultural global studies. So what are you seeing kind of longer term? Are you seeing a depletion in the stocks overall under higher emission scenarios?
We haven't looked in this project, but we have looked in previous projects, and you've got two factors at play. The climate change speeds the decomposition. So globally, we get a loss of soil carbon from the speeding of decomposition, but we also get an increase in the carbon inputs through an increased productivity. And what we found, and what are the outcomes of other simulations by Earth system models, is that soil carbon, just under the climate change scenarios, no management change and no land use change, they are actually projected in most areas of the world to increase. So that increase in plant productivity and carbon inputs to the soil tends to outweigh the speeding decomposition. So most Earth system models are showing that. It differs from place to place and region to region, but the overall global effect is an increase in soil carbon, which is perhaps counterintuitive.
That's great, thanks.
Thanks, Dimitri. David, you've been very patient with us. Would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. I want to revert to the answer that Professor Smith gave to Janet Whitaker. Yes, it is true that if you look at statements by the government and the Agriculture Act, it is true that it would be possible for them to divert public money to public goods in this direction. However, I'm sure you will realise the implications of the fact that the Committee on Climate Change insists that the only two negative emissions technologies of any merit are BECCS and DACs. I take the view that BECCS has not been demonstrated. They say that biochar and enhanced withering haven't been demonstrated. So my question is, do you consider the work that you've described, when you've got it finished, will be sufficient to persuade that committee to change its position?
Yes, that's a good question. I think biochar is earlier in its development. The technology readiness level is lower for biochar than it is for other things, because we know how to farm. We've been doing that for hundreds or thousands of years, but biochar has only been around for maybe the past 10 to 15 years. I think that the evidence base is becoming broader now. I think it's generally accepted that biochar addition to soils is a good thing for soil carbon sequestration. What is more of a problem is where we get the feedstock to produce that biochar.
Yes, yes.
If you're going to have like hundreds of thousands of hectares, if you need that to grow the feedstock in short rotation coppice or trees or straw or something to grow that material for the biochar, then we're talking about a whole different story. But most of the biochars that we're looking at in this situation are from agricultural residues. So could they be better utilized by converting them to biochar first and then adding them back to the soils? So they're only really going back to the soils from whence they came. And I think that has a lower environmental impact. So I'm hoping that this project and others that are going on, the many projects on biochar, will improve that evidence base to allow the Committee on Climate Change to assess it and to assess whether it is cost effective and an effective mitigation option. Good question, David. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we're running out of time now, and I know we haven't got through all of the questions on the chat. What I might do is just copy those into an email to Pete, and maybe you can answer them offline for us if he's okay to do that.
No problem. I'll do that, Phil.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'd like to just finish up by saying thanks again to Pete for his wonderful talk, and it seems like he's stimulated quite a lot of discussion in the questions there. And so thanks everyone for turning up and for asking your questions. Just a reminder that next week we've got a presentation by Professor Ewan Nisbet of Royal Holloway, so please do come along to that and register for that through our website and through Zoom. So, but otherwise, yeah, thank you for coming along, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Thanks everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.